She had already decided she would never see his face again when he found her behind the bus depot, fingers bruised where she dug at the slammed door, breath cracking in her throat as if the night wanted to swallow her whole. He came at dawn with the moon still clinging to the edges of the sky, and when his hand closed on the strap of her duffel, she felt the weight of everything she'd run from. Legal names, typed threats, the click of his keys, lift like a stubborn fog. "You come with me," he said, and there was no question in it, only an authority that cut through her panic and a tenderness that made her palms go numb. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this mystery has already captivated you, let us know where you're following this story from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected claims, broken bonds, or awakenings under the moon, subscribe and stay close. Now, back to the scene. He smelled like rain on iron, cold and clean, and so unfamiliar that Mara's teeth ached. For months, she had been learning invisibility, how to lower her shoulders, how to keep her eyes on the pavement so strangers could not read the bruise blooming along her cheekbone. She'd swapped the name he'd given her for a dozen aliases, sleeping in bus station doorways until it was dangerous to stay awake, and in cheap motels where the fluorescent hummed like a warning. The duffel at her feet was embroidered with a faded band logo and held the few things a woman fleeing violence could not part with: a change of clothes, a crumpled photograph of a woman whose smile she carried like contraband, a thin locket no money could buy back. She should have been grateful for rescue. Instead, she waited for the trap. The man, Lycan, the name landed in her like a second pulse, didn't explain. He put a scarf under the bruise, the wool warm and perfumed with something wild. His fingers were calloused in ways that suggested both battle and care. Height lifted him off the cracked concrete. His eyes were the color of old thunderclouds, the kind that promise storms, but also the kind that drink the air clean. Behind him, shadows folded and unspooled. Beyond the depot, the city continued its indifferent hum. Buses, a woman who laughed too loud into a phone, graffiti that read like small warnings. None of it penetrated the tiny, insistent cord that tied Mara's chest to the prospect of another chain. "You didn't answer anyone," he said, the words more observation than question. His voice could order her to run and command a pack at once. Even silenced, it suggested someone who was used to being obeyed, and to keeping others safe with rules of his own making. Mara answered with a shake of her head. She had run precisely to avoid the sound of questions. He let her keep the silence, but when a van of city workers pulled into the lot and 3 men descended, laughing, something in his body moved like a coiled thing. Protective, predatory. Her muscles clenched without permission. "Stay behind me," he murmured. And when the men's laughter died down as their lips caught his shadow in the light, Mara realized she had not been visible to them at all. To him, she was a presence to be shielded, a need to be catalogued. He shepherded her through alleys with an ease that suggested labyrinths behind his eyes, paths she had no map for. They moved until the city's bright face thinned, and the wayward murals gave up to iron gates and a narrow path flanked by hedges clipped into watchful shapes. They passed through the gates without challenge. The place he led her to was not urbane glamour, but a compound that smelled of wood smoke and older things, a house built of stone and bone memory, windows shuttered like sleeping eyes. Lanterns burned low, and figures melted into the threshold. Men and women who wore steadiness like armor. Lycan introduced none of them. He ushered Mara inside as if she were a necessity that had finally been returned to him. Inside, the air vibrated with the low murmur of 1,000 small alarms. Eyes assessed her as if counting flaws and advantages in a ledger. Elder wolves, though they would never be named so by the mortals, sat in a ring that felt like an accusation. Lucan's hand remained at the small of her back until she pulled away. "She's just run," he said to the ring, simple as if that explained everything. But against the dull light of the room, her bruised cheek and the way she flinched when men moved too quickly were more complicated proof. An old woman swathed in shawls, whispers called her Betty, a beta who had the smell of wet wool and the eyes of someone who had seen every sin a human could introduce into a pack, took Mara's wrist gently, like gauzing a wound. "You've been hurt," she said. Her voice had the patient certainty of one who stitched history into the present. When Mara said nothing, she kept speaking. "Men like him make marks that last longer than light." They fed her soup, vague and rich with herbs she couldn't name. They asked her name, and she looked at the duffel as if it could answer for her. Lucan said nothing, watching her the way a man studies a map for the dangerous parts. It hurt to be looked at that way. Crucial, accessible, detachable. She wanted to ask whether she was a refuge to him, a pawn, or something else entirely, but the words lodged in her throat like splinters. Later that night, Lucan walked her to a small room that smelled of cedar and wolf sheet and closed the door behind them. It was too much privacy, she realized, an intimacy that could be weaponized. "You could leave," she said, voice raw. "I don't want anything. I can be gone by dawn." "You will not be gone," he said with an almost painful steadiness that made his jaw work. "Not tonight." It should have felt like kindness. Instead, Mara catalogued the inequalities as if making a ledger might protect her. He had the shape of power. He had the right to command. She had the thin, trembling literacy of survival. The imbalance pressed along her ribs. "Why save me?" she asked finally. She expected a simple political calculus, useful flesh, bargaining chip. But the admission on his face made something ache in her, the kind of ache that remembers being loved badly and longs for better. "Because you were bleeding," he said. Because you could be used to hurt my pack, and I won't let that happen. And because," he swallowed, his composure frayed like a cloth at the edge. "Because I have nothing else that fits like this. I know how to stand in a field and make wolves obey me. I don't—" He stopped, and the rest went unspoken but hung there. "I don't know how to hold a woman who has escaped men like him without the old rules clamping down." The thing he called claim lived in that silence, heavy and historic. "You're an alpha," Mara said, the fact of it like a stone she could not miss. It was accusation and recognition both. In every book she'd read about men like this, the alpha's right was old law. Claim the mate, unite the pack. In every whispered warning she'd ever heard on frantic nights, such claims were bondage disguised as safety. She had escaped bondage. How could she accept a new shape of it? He looked at her then, and for the first time, the mask slipped enough for her to see the man who had been exiled from what should have been his birthright. The lines at his eyes suggested battles not just with teeth and claws, but with betrayals and loss. "I don't need another pawn," he said softly. "I need someone who is not afraid to speak up when being claimed would be wrong. He hesitated again. "I need someone who isn't part of the games they play." She should have asked who they were, in the raw political sense, who the pack's enemies were, what the cost of harboring her could be. Instead, she squinted at the shadowed corners where other eyes might be listening. She could imagine the way predators looked at a bruised bird. The knowledge that she carried the wrong blood, something whispered about in the courts of creatures she had not believed in, felt suddenly very real, a heritage she had never been allowed to own. Her mother's name, eaten by secrecy, suddenly throbbed under her skin like an unhealed tooth. Lycan told her nothing of that in the first hours. He brought her on a slow walk through the compound, introducing people as one might point out allies on a chessboard, betas who had sworn fealty, young wolves still raw with hunger for place. He moved among them like a man who knew the hurt of being looked at as a tool. No one in the compound touched her without asking. No one in the compound slept with their doors left unlocked. Yet the rules of the place were old and heavy, woven into the very timber of their kindness. Protection came with covenants. Covenants could be rewritten, but always had costs. When Lycan finally sat with her again, the moon had ridden higher, silvering the courtyard like the inside of an open wound. "You must tell me the truth," he said, and the imperative was a plea and a demand. "If the people who sent your husband want you, they will come for you. I cannot protect you if you keep secrets." She thought of the photograph in her duffel, of the woman who had taught her how to bake bread with patience. She thought of the bruise that would not be explained away with a scarf. She thought of the whispered court where the name of her mother, Ilara, Mara, had said once, and the name had hung in the air like an accusation. "I don't know what you mean," she lied at first, her thumb tracing the rim of the locket, until it hurt. Lycan did not look surprised by the lie. He only sighed, as if the shape of her denial had been the only predictable thing about the night. "Then we will keep you safe while you find out," he said. "You will stay here." He waited for her to resist. What she felt most vividly then was the hollow logic of choices: remain homeless and hunted, or enter a world where safety might mean subordination to an ancient law. Trust was thin as a paper bandage over a deep cut. She wanted to run, to disappear back into the night where anonymity could be both shield and punishment. Yet the knowledge that men in another city had access to her name, had power enough to make her husband their instrument, pressed like an iron hand around her throat. The dilemma set itself in her bones. To refuse the protection of a man whose instincts were to command was to risk death. To accept it without bargaining was to risk becoming the very thing she had escaped. Lycan watched the moon and did not offer an answer. Only the steady, unyielding claim of a man who believed rules could be remade. Around them, the pack breathed as one organism. Danger, calculation, longing, pulled taut and dangerous. When Mara closed her eyes, the picture of her mother's smile rose and then folded like a moth's wing. There was another face too, threaded at the edges of her memory. A woman with eyes like onyx who moved at court with deliberate politeness, the sort of smile that hides teeth. The whisper of that woman's name had floated across the underworld like smoke. If Ilara was the key the vampires coveted, then Mara's arrival was not an accident. The night settled. The question waited between them like a living thing. Would the protection she needed become a different prison? Or could she stand beside a man who had the power to bind and teach him, quiet and stubborn, to rewrite what it meant to claim? For a woman who had spent months shrinking into the seams of the world, the choice felt enormous and thin as thread. She lay awake and listened to the compound's breathing, the creak of floors, a distant laugh, the soft pad of a wolf's foot, and wondered which version of herself would survive the dawn. Mara dreamed in fragments: the slam of a door, the metallic smell of a key turned in an empty lock, a child's laughter that was not hers but fit the hollow in her chest like a borrowed glove. She woke with her hand pressed to the locket as if it were a compass, and found Lycan sitting on the edge of the bed, sleeves rolled against the cold of the night. He watched her with the gentleness of someone who had learned the language of small emergencies. The room smelled faintly of cedar and rain. Outside, the pack's compound sang with nocturnal life, soft, organized, like a heartbeat in a cave. "You slept," he said, as if surprised by the fact that her body could still find sleep, It was accusation and relief all at once. "Oh," she answered, the word thin. She scrubbed the backs of her hands against her face, pressing the bruise under the scarf. "That's all right." He reached for the scarf and tugged it back enough to see the bruise. Mara froze, balancing between the impulse to hide and the exhaustion that wanted the truth to be simple. His fingers were near tender as they lifted the fabric. His thumb smoothed an edge that was already beginning to yellow. "You should let me see it," he said. "You don't need to." She started to protest and then stopped. The protest felt ridiculous in a room where men and women carry steel and could silence assassins with a look. She allowed him to inspect the mark. He studied it the way a surgeon sizes up a wound, practical, not voyeuristic. He closed his hand around her wrist briefly, a hold with rules she could understand. No ownership implied, only steadiness. They spent the morning in a rhythm of small mercies. A woman named Rhea, lithe and precise, tended to Mara's cut with gentle, efficient fingers, dipping cloth in tea that smelled faintly of thyme. The wound was nothing compared to the ache lodged deeper, but cleaning it was a ritual that brought the body toward order. Rhea talked about mundane things: who had mended the roof, whose pup had been left alone in the nursery, and Mara clung to the ordinary like a raft. Conversation had rules here: names, roles, duties. The house was old and its people guarded. Even kindness came with a look that asked, "What will you do when called upon?" "Do you have anyone else?" Rhea asked plainly, as if the question were a kind that could be harvested and catalogued in a ledger. "No," Mara said. The answer was honest in its thinness. To say otherwise would reopen the risk she'd been fleeing. Later, Lycan took her to the grounds where the pack trained. Young wolves, teenage in their pretensions and bright with hunger, ran drills, chasing each other with a feral, affectionate cruelty. Lycan watched them, and Mara watched him watching them. He had a way of being natural in the field that made him appear inevitable, born to leadership like a river born to its course. But there was a fracture in the line of his jaw that made him human. Exile marked him like a scar no camouflage could hide. "Why keep me hidden in plain sight?" Mara asked, shaking a droplet from the hem of the linen he'd given her. "If you want me safe, why not move me away?" He paused, eyes toward the trees where the moonlight threaded through leaves. "This is home," he said simply, "and this is where I can command the laws that keep you alive. Moving you would make you a prize to follow." She let the word prize sit between them, heavy and humiliating. His hands dug into his pockets, his posture sharpened. "I know the politics," he added. "I know what this looks like. You are not an object to me. I won't pretend old laws don't exist, but I will not let anyone, pack, vampire, or man, take you as if you were something owed." He said that, and she believed him in the way one believes promises made in storms: plausible, necessary, and possibly temporary. The truth was that power in that compound came with teeth. It could shield, but it also could swallow. She felt the tug of both, safety and the possibility of exchange. She wanted to ask him how deep the wound of his exile went, why his claim sat like a rumor on his tongue. But her voice faltered with the memory of men who wore apologies like chains. Tensions rose without spectacle. The elders' looks were knives wrapped in velvet. A council meeting, formal, the way a pack confers when treaties are to be renewed, was convened not long after Mara's arrival. She was asked to sit at the edge of the room like someone to be acknowledged without being permitted to speak. It made her angry in a way she had not anticipated. The indignity of being kept aside, a bright, dangerous thing under glass. The elders' debates circled around her like predators sniffing at a new scent. Hints and whispers floated. Her lineage, a mother named Ilara, whose name trembled like an old bell in their mouths. The vampire's interest, the political advantage that might be gained by aligning with or containing her. Voices pitched toward the pragmatic. An alliance with the old court would shore up our borders, one elder said. Binding her would end the rumor and secure a claim, another offered. Lycan's jaw tightened. He listened with the control of a man who had learned to govern not with impulse, but with the weight of history. When he spoke, his voice drew from a place that refused to commodify the living. "She is not a bargaining chip," he said. And something in the room shifted. Old alliances folded a little, cautious like a wolf pulling its tail in near fire. Mara felt both anger and gratitude at his defense. Gratitude tugged like a warmth at the edges of her chest. Anger sat heavier, the bitter knowledge that his defense did not erase the way she had been held and hurt. She teetered between wanting to collapse into his arms like a rescued child and to carve a line through him that said, "I will not be owned." That night, when the moon poured like milk across the compound, a shadow moved at the gate. Lycan sniffed the air with an expression she'd seen only twice before, once on the night he found her, and once in the council where he'd drawn a sword with words. "They come looking," he said, before she could ask. Her heart turned to stone. Who? He did not need to name them. The pack had enemies who took names like trophies. Vampire elders with the patience of tombstones. Human men seduced by promised power. The compound's mood changed like a wind from the mountains. People moved with the tidy efficiency of animals whose lives are shaped by danger. Weapons checked, signals exchanged with a flick of an eyebrow. Lycan stayed near her, a presence that both soothed and compressed. "You could leave," he said again, matter of fact, as if offering her an exit door. "Before things escalate. There are safe paths out if you want them." She realized she was tired of being given the choice between invisibility and exposure, imprisonment and precarious freedom. "Leave to where?" she asked. The only places outside were doorways and motels, people who glanced away from ones like her. To leave was to step back into the world that had nearly killed her. He watched her for a long moment, as if measuring the exact weight of a decision. "Or you can stand with us," he said finally, and there was a plea in the offering that was almost shameful. "You can learn what your blood means, and when they come, you will not go alone." The words fell between them and made the air taste metallic. Learn what her blood meant, what a phrase contained that the thing she had never belonged to might be the key to more than survival. It was the pull of a new identity, but it was also the threat of erasure. Be made into something besides your own self to fulfill someone else's need. A reply braided through her like a cold. "How do I know you won't bind me when I am weak?" she asked. Her voice was steady now, the steadiness of someone who had been pushed to a limit and found an edge. "How do I know you won't make me trade my freedom for shelter?" Lycan's mouth went thin. The old anger flared, but something gentler held it back. "You can make me promise," he said. "You can make me swear it in front of witnesses. You can demand terms. I will not make a law that binds you without consent." She felt the skepticism in her bones. Words were cheap. Rituals were older, heavier. But the offer of terms, a bargaining of power, pressed at the raw wound inside her. He was offering not only protection, but the possibility of negotiation. And that small lever made her blood loosen in her limbs. They moved toward a reckoning none of them wanted. The compound sealed itself tighter. The pack would be tested by the tide that sought to claim Mara, and Lycan's willingness to renegotiate old rules would be put under the furnace of politics. Mara's history, Ilara's name, hung like a storm front in the world beyond. She had a choice that no one should ever have to make: to stay in a place where power could shelter, or to risk vanishing back into homelessness in the hope that anonymity could buy her autonomy. Lycan spent the night drafting provisions, like someone learning to translate a language he had always spoken differently. He consulted the elders, argued with them, and then argued against them. He placed his attention like a blanket over her needs, but the edges of that blanket were frayed by history. When he finally came to her with a list, terms of safety, witness, and the right to leave on her word alone, she could see the strain of his compromise chiseled into his face. It was inadequate, and it was something. The choice was not simply between survival and freedom, but between two imperfect paths. The pack sharpened their claws against the coming storm. Outside, somewhere in the city, agents of a court whose teeth gleamed in the moon's light were moving pieces on a board that had not yet shown itself. Mara lay awake and listened to Lycan's breathing from the adjoining room, the small animal steadiness that had, in a night, become as familiar as the sound of rain. She kept thinking of a photograph in her duffel, a woman with soft hands who had once taught her to fold dough until it obeyed. The memory felt like an instruction manual for survival. You keep going, the woman's smile seemed to say, and you do not let anyone turn you into something you are not. When dawn cut the sky thin and blue, the compound was a tension of ready steel and false ordinary life. Children ran underfoot, pretending the coming war was a game. Sentries took post with the casual economy of habit. Lycan stood at the gate and watched the road like a man waiting for a verdict. Mara approached him then, the decision settled in her mouth like a seed. She had not decided what she would do, whether to sign the accords he had drafted or to take her duffel and step into the uncertain gray of the city. But she had decided, with the cold clarity of someone who had lived in hollow places, that she would not be chosen for another's convenience. "Tell me," she said, voice low, "if I agree to stay, truly agree, what will you give me besides the walls? What will you become for me to prove this is not just shelter?" Lycan met her eyes and, for once, the mask slipped. He looked like a man who'd been learning to breathe without the old rules. "I will listen," he said. "I will make space for your voice in council. I will step down if keeping you means I must become a tyrant. I will not let you be forced. I will not trade you for a throne." His answer was blunt, honest in the way of a man who had been stripped of certainty and was trying to construct a new one. It did not erase the risk. It did offer something far more dangerous, the invitation to love a man who could claim and who was learning, painfully, to unlearn. She felt the pull of something that was not alike to safety nor to bondage, a slender bridge made of trust and terms. It would be treacherous and perhaps not wide enough for both of them to stand without slipping. But for the first time since the bus depot, Mara felt like she might choose rather than be chosen. The day placed itself over them like a dare. The world outside thrummed with a quiet menace, but within the compound a negotiation had begun, between a woman who had been made small and a man who carried the heavy shape of power and was learning, liminal and raw, how to change. When the first envoy arrived, an emissary from the vampire court with eyes like polished glass and compliments folded around fangs, their terms would be tested. The city would whisper her name. Her husband's shadow would stretch toward them like a threat. And Mara, for the first time in months, felt the blood in her veins twinge as if something inside her recognized an answer it had been denied. She rose and took the locket between her fingers, feeling its weight. It was small, ordinary, and absolute. Inside it lay the photograph of the woman who had taught her how to be human in a world that wanted to make monsters of them all. Outside, a raven perched on a branch and watched the compound with dark, patient eyes. The storm that had been promised in Lycan's gaze did not belong solely to him. It belonged to the way the world would ask someone like Mara to become currency, prophecy, weapon, and heart. Between breaths, she offered herself the one prayer she had kept secret since the depot. Let me be my own name again. Let me make the choice. The gates creaked open and closed as the compound adjusted itself for what was to come. In the courtyard, Lycan's shadow brushed hers for a heartbeat. No ceremony, no claim, just the proximity of two people who had been pulled from the edges and were learning, dangerously and magnificently, how to stand together. The envoy smelled of perfume and old bones. The vampire's hand that settled on Mara's shoulder at the threshold was cool and too polite, fingers that promised everything and killed by slow degrees. He introduced himself as Corvin, and his smile was the shape of patience grown predatory. He wore civility like a cloak, and the compound felt suddenly too small for the kind of civility that preys on faint things. When Corvin spoke of Ilara, it was as if the name unlocked a room the pack had kept shuttered. "We regret the trouble this little matter has caused," he said, his voice syrup smooth. "But lineage is lineage. The court has reasons to claim consideration, a ritual of acknowledgement, a binding that would place a ward on her to ensure mutual safety." Lycan's mouth closed around a sound that resolved into a word: no. It was not a public declaration. He did not make it theatrical. He said simply, "We won't be bargaining human lives for political theater." Corvin's smile tightened. "A peacemaking ceremony is hardly barter. We are offering protection and a seat at the old court's table. Alliances are forged with the blood of those whose names matter. Think of the security. Think of your claim restored." Mara watched both men. Corvin's words were like slow knives, promises that aim for the soft spots, strategic and polite. Lycan's refusal rose like a threat, and then like a promise, and she felt, for a moment, the small boom of pride in being defended. The elders around the circle shifted. Some nodded at Corvin's logic with animal pragmatism. A woman with silver at her temple, an elder named Maris, gave Lycan a look that asked him to think like an alpha, not an idealist. "You will let the court speak for us?" she asked. "Our borders bleed. If an old alliance could be renewed—" Lycan's answer came as if he had swallowed a stone. "I won't hand her over to be a token. I don't bargain with the living for the dead's favors." "But she is a key, or at least—" Maris's voice frayed. "If we refuse, we risk war with a court that is patient." The discussion unspooled into tactical considerations. Mara felt herself become a margin note, the subject of futures debated like weather. She had spoken up once in council and been told it was not her place, and every rebuke had cut deeper than any bruise. The amphibious politeness of Corvin's court and the blunt loyalty of Lycan's camp were being measured against one another by people who believed that lives could be weighed as coin. When a messenger arrived at dusk, one of Lycan's scouts with the look of someone who had seen too many things he could not name, his face was a letter that spelled bad news. He brought a scrap of paper and the information in it like a wound. Mara's husband had been seen in the city, in a backroom meeting, his hand on a scroll with the vampire sigil she'd never wanted to know. Mara's breath left her in a high, paper-thin sound. She had expected him to find her eventually, but not as a collaborator. The idea that he might have been turned, convinced, or paid, any of it, felt like salt ground into fresh bruises. She thought of his hands, the small kindnesses that had been camouflage for cruelty. She had never imagined him walking willingly into the web of vampires. Yet here was evidence that horror wore many faces. Lycan's reaction was clean and ugly. He did not shout. He did not show a ritual alpha's fury in public. He folded his hands and went quiet, the way a cliff goes quiet before a landslide. "Bring him," he said, "and bring the men he met with." The capture was swift, and the compound's efficiency was a machine with a heart of ice. Her ex-husband was dragged in not as the monstrous, towering figure she feared, but as a small, defeated man with eyes like a dog caught in a man's collar. His face when he saw Mara was the shape of something needing mercy and not receiving it. "You came," he whispered, voice a slither. Rumors and power had coated him since the night he'd disappeared. Now the sheen peeled away. He was frightened in a way that was not pitiable. He had been made small by choices that were his and others. Corvin watched from the doorway with an amused blankness. "You can be useful," he murmured to Lycan later, as if to remind him of the inevitable calculus. They took the husband to an interrogation room and let the questions come like rain. He spilled what he had to, promises of money, threats that had enough leverage to bend men of lesser will. He had been promised protection for his debts. He had thought, infuriating, heartbreaking, that the vampires would give him power in exchange for bringing a name forward. He had thought he could live like he'd once pretended, safe, above the laws that had kept him small. He had been wrong. "You led them to me," Mara said later, the accusation a blade she did not feel right until it was already cutting. It tasted like rust and grief. "You used my name. For what? For promises?" He stopped looking like a man and began to look like an animal that had been petted until it learned how to perform. "They said they'd help," he whispered. "They said, Elara said." The name hit Mara like a slap, and in the recesses of the room she heard the echo of the vampire's earlier civility. Lycan's face went ashen, something like regret layered over calculation. "They promised him favors," he said. "They made him think they were doing him a service." Mara retched against the back of a chair, the visceral response to betrayal she had thought a thing of the past. Grief and fury braided together. The world had shrunk to the smallness of a man who had tried to trade her in for his keeping. She felt the pack's walls close, instruments ready for a fight that could devour them all. But politics is a hungry beast, and it does not eat only its enemies. The elders, who had argued for prudence, began to shift at this new information. "He was a pawn," Maris said, pragmatic, "but a pawn who led hunters to our threshold." Corvin's smile returned in full. "You see, we offer sanctuary, and look, your enemy provides his own betrayal as proof of necessity." He circled them like a shark gilded in velvet. Lycan's jaw set. He tried to be the kind of leader he wanted to be, righteous, fair, willing to cut out the rot without desecrating the living. He ordered the husband held but not killed. He sought answers, not vengeance as spectacle. Mara, however, saw only the old pattern. The man she loved in another life had colluded with those who would use her blood as currency. She realized she had been kept a secret not just for her safety, but as a bargaining chip in a game she had never agreed to play. That night, while Lycan met with elders and vampires to guard them from open war, someone else was at work. A witch named Tamsin, who had been a friend to Rhea and an exile in her own right, cornered Mara in a storage shed filled with herbs and old maps. "You need to know what you're sitting on," Tamsin said bluntly. "This is not about lineage the way you think. Your blood carries an old binding. It can open things or close them. It is the kind of thing courtiers and old houses will die to control." Mara drew back as if struck. My mother, Elara, was a vampire? The question was a desperate, raw thing. Tamsin shook her head. No, Elara was more complex. She walked at the intersection of houses. She bound bargains. She made pacts with her life as leverage. She made enemies. She made you a solution. The words formed a map that Mara had not asked for. Her mother had not simply been a woman who smiled with dough under her nails. She had been a player in a dangerous chessboard. Every new detail was betrayal another layer deep. She had not simply been hidden from her family's past. She had been a product of it, a living instrument meant to be used. By the time dawn bled into a grim yellow, the compound was a formal seam of tension. Corvin had not left. The vampire's manners had become more baroque, more insinuating. He proposed a public ritual, a binding that would place Mara under the court's partial aegis. In exchange, the vampiric elders would withdraw their political maneuvers and offer Lycan a seat of influence the pack had long sought. It was clean, elegant, devastating. Lycan's face closed like a book. He had promised her rights, terms, the possibility of leaving. The proposal required a formal public consent in front of witnesses, exactly the kind of theater that turned autonomy into a token. Corvin's offer was poison in sugar. The elders liked the clarity of trade. Maris liked the promise of borders secured. The compound breathed with readiness to take the bargain. "You will not glower at me as if I do not see how desperate this is," Corvin said to Lycan, as if instructing a child who struggles to be grown. Mara felt something inside her harden. Lycan met the vampire's eyes, the old hunger of a man prepared to sacrifice anything for order. The doubt that had lived under Mara's ribs, his capacity to do what he said he wouldn't, became a live question in her mouth. "Consent is not given under threat," she said loudly, the room stilled by the audacity of her voice. "I will not be the currency that buys your agreements." Lycan looked as if struck. The elders' faces, lined with hunger and fatigue, shifted like weather. Mara's expression was disappointment, not horror. She had expected gratitude, not defiance. She had expected a woman saved would see shelter as payment. "You put me in a room to bargain," Mara kept saying, the truth absolute and raw. "You offered me protection and then sat with people willing to make me into something else. If you cannot shelter me without promising my consent to others, then you have not protected me. You have traded me." He stepped forward like a man trying to stitch a torn sail. "I did not," he began. "You did," she cut in. "You brought me into a room where men and elder things debate my fate as if I were a scrap of ledger. You think you can protect me by placing me under others' rules." The fracture made a sound like ice breaking. In the silence, a younger wolf, one Mara had begun to trust, looked at Lycan with the uncertain eyes of someone who wanted to believe in him and did not yet know if he could be that alpha. The elders talked among themselves in thinly veiled whispers about discipline and precedent. Corvin's smile sharpened with the knowledge that the strongest thing in the room, the man who had found her, was being drawn into a choice that might destroy the tender trust forming between them. Lycan's face crumpled in a way that Mara's chest ached. "I will not let them take you," he said finally, familiar authority fraying into a rueful, helpless thing. "But I cannot go to war on whispers either. If we refuse, they will come anyway." "You will offer my consent as a bargaining chip," she said. "You will place me under their ritual and call it protection." The betrayal was a clean blade. She could feel it cutting the last polite stitches of their fragile arrangement. He tried to reach for her hand, and she snatched it away, like a reflex that had been practiced for months. "I tried to make space for you," he said. "I drafted terms." You bound terms with people who would silence me," she finished. "I cannot trust a man who thinks security is a thing to be purchased with my body." Lycan's eyes brimmed, an admission and a confession. For a heartbeat, she saw him as a bruised man, not an alpha, learning the shape of power that was not command but stewardship. He had misjudged, perhaps, the gravity of offering a woman shelter in a world where men barter flesh for advantage. It was a failure, not of intent alone, but of the system he had failed to unlearn. Mara gathered her duffel. The movement was both defiance and old habit. She had left once without looking back. She had learned how to be invisible. This time, the winds were different. The moon watched from a high, indifferent sky, and the compound's doors felt like the mouth of a house that had just shown its teeth. Around them, Corvin's satisfaction was a slow, patient tide. As she moved toward the door, Lycan called her name once, not as a summons, but as a plea. "Stay," he said, voice wounded. "I will not trade you away, I promise." But the promises hung fragile in a room full of people who measured outcomes like weapons. The fracture between them was not a savage rupture, but a cold, crystalline thing. A difference in what protection required and what consent meant. Mara had escaped one kind of ownership only to be offered another under gilded terms. She could not, would not, sign the ledger to say she consented to being used, even for safety. To give in would be to become the arrangement she had fled. She stepped into the moonlight with her duffel at her side, the compound's lights dropping away behind her like last night's stars. The air outside smelled of wet asphalt and ash. The city was awake in a way that had nothing to do with their small politics. Its traffic a distant pulse, indifferent to courts and pack rules. She had, for months, been a ghost to that city. Tonight, she chose the bitter clarity of being visible rather than the contaminated safety of being marked. Lycan watched her go, hands clenched at his sides. The pack breathed around him, some ready to chase, some ready to watch, some ready to follow. Corvin's eyes met Lycan's across the courtyard, and in that look, Mara saw the predator's calculating satisfaction at a deal that might be concluded on someone else's body. Her ex-husband watched from the interrogation room where the truth had been pried open. He watched with the small animal face of a man who had traded his own soul to the wrong keeps. Mara walked out into the thin night, into a city that had no interest in making her saga easy. As she moved away, she felt the weight of what the compound had been. Safety, possibility, betrayal, all braided together. In her chest, the locket hit like a metronome, measuring the beat of choices. Flee into anonymity and risk annihilation, or return and risk becoming the instrument of old bargains. The moon watched them all, Lycan, Corvin, the elders, the small man who had been her husband. Under that indifferent light, relationships cracked, and a new line was drawn. Trust lay in splinters between the compound's walls. Mara's footsteps receded until they were only memory on the damp pavement. Behind her, silent doors closed. The night had not decided them. It had only begun to break them open. Mara had not gone far. The city keeps you because it knows the soles of your shoes and the angles of your fear. It lets you think you are anonymous long enough for memory to sharpen into a decision. She had found a bench under a tarped storefront and set the duffel beside her like a small island. Rain began to feather the pavement, and the lights of the street blurred until everything looked like memory. She told herself she would be brave in the old way, quiet, small, but the truth was messier. She was furious in a way that made her hands tremble. When Lycan found her, he did not come with a pack at his back, but with a single oath in his mouth and the clumsy vulnerability of a man who had learned the hard lesson that power without consent is just another tyrant. He took the bench across from her like a soldier taking a wound. His boots were smeared with the compound's mud. The exile's coat wore the smell of wood and other lives. For a long minute they regarded each other across a distance that had once been measured by the size of his hand. "I should have known," he said, and the sentence held no excuses, only the bitter accounting of a man who realized his protection had been an arrangement without a woman's voice. God, I thought I could turn the rules on their heads and keep you safe. I was arrogant." Mara listened to him shake the words free like pebbles. His face had the same tired angles she'd seen in the compound, the exile's map of loss. But in the streetlight there was something new, shame that wanted to be useful. You offered me a choice inside a room where men had already decided my value, she said. The accusation was not savage. It was the plumbing of her life, clean, necessary. I know, he said. He reached for her hand before she could pull it away, and this time did not try to seal it. Let me fix what I broke. Let me show you what stewardship looks like. If I cannot offer you that, I will step aside so you may be free. She had imagined he would fight the vampires. She had imagined other, simpler, grand gestures. This was not a sweep of muscle or a war cry. It was a bearing of the thing she wanted most from him, the willingness to lose power in order to keep her whole. You could step down, she said, surprise cracking her voice. You could give up what they taught you was an alpha. How could that change anything while they still want to use me? He closed his eyes then, and when he spoke, the words were brittle as dried leaves. Because I will make a sacrifice that cannot be traded. I will renounce claim. I will give up the right that would let me hand you to anyone or make you a token. I will put my name to paper before witnesses and swear that my protection does not cost you your body or your agency. If the court wants an alpha's arbitration, they will not find it in me. Mara's throat worked around an answer. To renounce such an essential part of him would be to change him at the root. It would also be a blade against the pack's politics, a scandal that could leave him vulnerable. She could hear the elders saying his name like an omen. She could hear Corvin's smile widening like a trap. "You would make yourself weaker for me?" she asked, and the incredulity in her voice was also gratitude. People did war for kings. This man was willing to dismantle kingship for a single human being's freedom. "For you," he said, "for us, for the possibility of leading a pack that does not traffic in bodies. That's what I want to teach them with my surrender, that stewardship can be an act of losing power to gain trust." The rain thickened, and Lycan's hand tightened around hers like a quiet covenant. He rose and pulled her up with him. "Come back," he said. "Let me make it real." She could have refused. She almost did, out of habit and principle and the memory of being bartered. But when you have spent months living as a ghost, a step towards someone who is dismantling the architecture of your captivity can feel like a strategic surrender. It is not capitulation. It is a choice toward shared danger. Back at the compound, the council watched like weather. Corvin arrived with his courtly teeth and calm cruelty, his proposals wrapped in velvet that smelled of wine and rot. He expected a bargaining table and a woman who would name the price of peace. Instead, he found Lycan at the center of the ring, with a scroll in his hands and something like defiance in his voice. "I renounce claim," Lycan announced, the words falling into the hush like stone. "I relinquish any right that would bind another to me without free consent. I will sign here, in front of witnesses, that I am not a man who owns a life as payment for political gains. If you wish an alliance, you will negotiate with us as peers, not with my giving of a human tree to be pruned." Murmurs rose. Corvin's smile sharpened into something dangerous. "Dramatic," he purred, "but a performance does not change what blood is. A court cannot be persuaded by sentiment." Mara stepped forward then, feeling the old rawness bloom and an odd power unspool within it. She had been practicing small refusals for months. Now she would make the largest one. "You will not have my blood," she said, voice clear. "No ritual, no binding. I will not be currency for a bargain. We can make alliances without my surrendering myself." Corvin's eyes glittered like knives. "You will make us vulnerable by refusing." Or you will make us stronger by learning to bargain without buying bodies, Lycan countered, and his gaze held a fierceness that was not about dominance, but about reform. The elders traded angrier glances. A few murmured that Lycan had grown soft. Others looked stunned enough to listen. Corvin took a step forward, nostrils flaring, and the air seemed to thicken. "If you refuse, we take other measures," he said, the threat clear as winter. "We can bring pressure where you least expect it." Lycan made a sound like a blade pulled from a leather sheath. He did not raise it. Instead, he offered what was harder: his status, his claim, public and irreversible. The scroll he signed was not just a legal instrument in pack language. It was the most visible renunciation an alpha could make. He abdicated a right older than their bloodlines in a gesture that would make him vulnerable to coups and insults. He chose exile again, but this time as penance and promise. "What you ask, your safety without the giving of yourself, I cannot promise by words alone," Lycan said to Mara when the ritual closed like a door. "But I can put my name where the world will read it and know I did not trade you. I can fight them and give up what I might have held as leverage." She watched him, and the man before her was both the same and changed. The same storm in his eyes, the new willingness to be small for her sake. There were no clean endings here. Corvin's temporariness was a danger still. But for the first time, the balance shifted so that Mara's consent mattered as a force, not a footnote. Later, when Corvin withdrew with promises veiled as threats, and the elders argued into the small hours, Mara and Lycan stood on the compound's stone wall and let the night press around them. "You could have stayed," she said, voice thin. "I would have betrayed us both if I had," he answered. He took her hand as if to measure the truth of it. "This is not a victory, it is a start. I cannot undo what others have done, but I can refuse to be the man who makes you part of the ledger." She leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady rise of his chest like a promise that required no law to hold it. In a world that loved to turn names into currency and love into collateral, he had chosen instead the harder thing: to lose power, to gain trust. It was not salvation for all the wounds, but it was a sacrifice that unlatched something inside her, an opening she had feared to name. The vampires would not disappear. Corvin would not be placated easily. But in the small hours, with the compound asleep and the moon dragged thin across the sky, two people who had been pulled from edges found the dangerous, luminous shape of a new vow: protection that cost nothing of the protected. They stood there, gritty and raw and trembling with possibility, and let the rain wash the night's threats from their skin. Lycan's sacrifice had been public and costly, and with it he had bought something no treaty could: the knowledge that he had chosen her freedom over his claim. It would not end the wars, nor erase the past, but it made the future bearable. And that, in a world that trafficked in inevitabilities, felt revolutionary. They stayed until the rain slowed to a hush, and when Mara finally spoke, it was not a promise, but a beginning. "Stay," she said, the word a test and an answer both. "Not because you asked, but because you chose to be the kind of man who could keep me without owning me." He smiled, the kind that lit the shadows from within. "Then stay," he said, "and teach me how to lead the pack that will deserve you." They did not know what would come: vampire courts, old grudges, and the fragile politics of a world that would always try to trade what it could not make its own. But in the small surrender he had made, a renunciation that cost him authority and gained him truth, Lycan had offered Mara the most dangerous kind of shelter, the one that trusted her to choose. She accepted, not as a fetter, but as a partnership formed in fire, and together they walked back to the compound, feet wet, spirits raw, and hearts finally speaking the language of consent. They moved through the compound like two people learning a new song. Steps tentative, rhythms uncertain, voices keeping time. The elders argued through the night, voices fraying into compromises that would buy breathing room but not peace. Corvin's threats retreated into the city like a tide that promised to return. Still, the aftermath of Lycan's renunciation changed the air. Men who had measured worth by lineage now watched a different ledger being written. Conversations that had once been about territory and leverage became, slowly and awkwardly, about repair. Mara found herself pulled into the small domesticities of the place as if by gravity. Rhea teaching her to mend a torn coat with a stitch that held against weather. Betty showing her how to braid a rope of herbs into a ward that smelled like safe kitchens. Young wolves asking her to show them how to fold bread so the crust would sing with salt. Each small task was a reclamation, a way to be useful without being used. It thrilled and terrified her, the way ordinary kindnesses always did, because kindness was the thing she had been denied most of all. Lycan did the harder work. He faced clean, practical problems, teasing apart old precedents, arguing with elders who counted tradition like currency, defending the renunciation until it was a documented act the court could not easily erase. He learned to ask questions instead of issuing commands, to invite counsel instead of dictate, to take Mara's opinions into a room and present them with the weight of his name behind them. It made him smaller in some measures and larger in others. The pack watched, sometimes hopeful, often skeptical, but the measure of a leader began to shift in the air like a wind carrying new seeds. Mara practiced being seen on her own terms. She sat at council tables as an equal in ways that were earned and awkward. She negotiated the terms of her own safety instead of having them offered at banquet. The locket at her throat grew warm with use. She stored the photograph of the woman who'd taught her patience in a place of honor and spoke often of recipes and of the small, stubborn insistence required to make dough rise. In teaching the pack to bake, she taught them how to wait for the right moment, the same patience that would be needed in politics and in knitting trust back together. They did not pretend the world was fixed. Corvin remained a threat, a shadowed presence in rooms and rumors. Wolves and vampires would bargain and bruise one another for years. But inside the compound, something quieter grew. A covenant shaped not by the ownership of bodies, but by the accountability of power. Lycan's abdication had been a violent, public sacrifice. Its fruit was not immediate adoration, but a slow accrual of trust. One evening, months after the night at the depot, Mara stood on the same stone wall where they had first spoken of renunciation. The moon painted the courtyard silver, and the pack's children, no longer pretending every training was a war, ran at the hedges with laughter like new bells. Lycan stood beside her, not in the posture of claim, but as a man who had learned the humility of stewardship. He reached for her hand, fingers warm and calloused in the way they always had been. There was still danger in the world, and there would be nights when they would not sleep. She looked up at him, at the line his face had taken from exile to an unsteady kind of grace. "Are you afraid?" she asked, not the old test of strength, but the real question two people who meant to change one another must ask. He smiled in that crooked, honest way that had started to feel like home. "Terrified," he said, "and hopeful." They leaned into each other, a small, stubborn architecture. Not the ceiling of a claim, but the building of a life that insisted on consent as its foundation. Below them, the compound breathed, a community, imperfect and alive. While beyond the trees, the city throbbed with old politics. A raven took flight into the moonlight, and their shadows stretched together across the stone like a single, tentative map. Mara tightened her grip on the locket, feeling the small, ordinary weight of it. The world would still ask things of them. It always would. But for the first time since the bus depot, She felt the possibility of answering as herself. The night held them, and the moon kept careful watch.